Ethan Lawson stepped out of his car, adjusting his suit as he hurried toward Greenville Municipal Court. He hated being late. As a federal prosecutor, discipline and punctuality were second nature, but this morning had thrown him off course. Still, he had made it just in time to contest an unfair property tax adjustment on the house his grandmother left him, a place that held his most cherished memories. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with routine cases. Ethan scanned the room. A few others had slipped in after the session started, unnoticed. When his name was called, he stepped forward, calm and prepared. "You're late, Mr. Lawson. That will be a $750 fine," Judge Ronald Mercer declared. The room fell silent. Ethan blinked. Other latecomers had been ignored, but he had been singled out. As he returned to his seat, one thought gripped him. This was no accident.
Before we dive into today's story, we'd love your support. If you enjoy our content, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and leave a comment below sharing your thoughts. Your engagement helps us create more inspiring stories just for you. Now, without further ado, let's get started.
Ethan sat rigidly in his seat, his fingers tightening around the folder in his lap. He kept his expression neutral, but inside, his mind was running at full speed. Something wasn't right. Judge Ronald Mercer had barely glanced at the other defendants who arrived late. A middle-aged white man in a grey blazer had entered 5 minutes after court began, slipping into a seat unnoticed. A young woman with blonde hair had come in moments later, casually scrolling through her phone. Neither had been reprimanded. Neither had been fined. Yet Ethan, dressed in a sharp navy suit and a crisp white shirt, standing with the poise of a seasoned federal prosecutor, had been singled out. He let his gaze sweep across the room. The courtroom had the familiar hum of municipal justice, where people came to settle minor disputes. Parking violations, small claims, tax adjustments. The space itself was unremarkable. Dull beige walls, worn wooden benches, a faint smell of coffee and old paper, but there was something else lingering in the air now, a tension that hadn't been there before. A few people in the audience stole glances at him, their expressions a mix of curiosity and discomfort. Ethan could sense that they had noticed it too, the shift, the difference in treatment. His years in courtrooms, both as a prosecutor and as an observer of human behavior, had trained him to recognize patterns, and what had just happened was no coincidence. Ethan turned his attention back to Judge Mercer, who had already moved on, calling up the next case without a second thought. The judge's voice was crisp and controlled as he addressed a young white man stepping forward. "You were cited for parking in a restricted zone," Judge Mercer stated, flipping through a file. The young man nodded sheepishly. "Yes, Your Honor. I was only there for a couple of minutes. I didn't realize." Mercer raised a hand, cutting him off, but his tone remained even. "Be more mindful next time. Your fine is reduced to $50. Ethan's jaw tightened. Moments ago, he had been fined $750 for being a few minutes late. And yet, here was someone else, a white defendant, given leniency without argument. This wasn't about rules. This was about who the rules were being applied to. Ethan had seen this before, in whispered stories from colleagues, in cases buried under procedural red tape, in the way certain clients received harsher sentences for the same crimes committed by others. But it was different experiencing it firsthand, being on the receiving end of a judge's quiet but undeniable bias. As a prosecutor, he believed in the system. He had spent his career defending the law, upholding justice, ensuring fairness. But sitting there, watching the double standard play out in real time, he felt a rare frustration coil in his chest. He had learned long ago to pick his battles wisely, to avoid reacting emotionally. But this wasn't just about him. This was about a system that had been allowed to operate unchecked. The longer he sat, the more he noticed. An older black man in the second row, wearing a well-worn tweed jacket, turned slightly and met Ethan's gaze for just a second. A knowing look, No words were spoken, but the message was clear. You're not the first. A court clerk, Mrs. Phillips, hesitated slightly when typing the judge's orders, her fingers pausing a beat longer than necessary before entering the fine into the system. She glanced at Ethan just once, then quickly looked away. They saw it too. This wasn't an isolated moment. This was a pattern. Ethan reached into his briefcase, pulling out a notepad. He flipped to a fresh page and started writing. Every detail, every inconsistency, every instance of unfairness. Judge Mercer's demeanor towards him versus others, the white latecomers who weren't reprimanded, the judge's selective tone when addressing different defendants, the fine amounts, who got reduced penalties and who didn't. This was no longer about his grandmother's house or a property tax adjustment. This was about something bigger. He glanced up, watching Judge Mercer move through the docket, his face unreadable. The judge had no idea who he had just tried to silence. Ethan wasn't just another defendant. He was a federal prosecutor, and he knew exactly how to build a case. Ethan took a steady breath as he walked back toward the podium. The weight of the courtroom's attention followed him. Every step felt deliberate, measured, because he knew what was coming. Judge Ronald Mercer barely looked up from the papers in front of him as Ethan placed his folder down. His fingers tapped against the desk, a signal of impatience. "Proceed," the judge said flatly. Ethan kept his voice calm, his posture composed. "Your Honor, I'm here today to dispute an unjust increase in property taxes on a home that has been in my family for generations. The city raised the taxes without proper notification or explanation. I've compiled all the necessary documentation, past tax assessments, property records, and a legal review, demonstrating that this increase was an error." He opened the folder, laying out the neatly arranged pages. "Here's the original tax assessment over the last 5 years. Consistent rates. No changes. However, this year, the adjustment reflects a 30% increase, with no justification." He slid the documents forward. "I'm asking the court to recognize this as an error and have the adjustment reversed." Judge Mercer barely glanced at the paperwork. Instead, he sat back in his chair, his sharp blue eyes settling on Ethan like a weight. "Mr. Lawson," he said slowly, his tone patronizing, "before we address your request, there's still the matter of your contempt of this court." Ethan remained perfectly still. "Contempt, Your Honor." "You were late," Mercer said, tapping his gavel lightly against the wood. "This court operates on discipline and order. If I let one person break the rules, what precedent does that set?" Ethan tilted his head slightly. "With respect, Your Honor, I noticed other individuals arriving late today without consequence, yet I was fined immediately. Could you clarify what specific circumstances made my case different?" A murmur rippled through the room. Judge Mercer's expression hardened. "Are you questioning my judgment, Mr. Lawson?" "I'm asking for consistency, Your Honor," Ethan replied evenly. "If rules exist to maintain fairness, then they should be applied equally to everyone who enters this courtroom." For the first time, Mercer seemed to hesitate. It was subtle, a brief tightening of his jaw, a flicker of something in his gaze. Then he recovered. "This court does not entertain baseless accusations. Your fine stands. Now, regarding your property tax case, I'll review your documents in due time." Ethan knew what that meant. It meant his case would sit on a desk for weeks, buried under other paperwork, ignored. The judge was sending a message. Know your place, accept the fine, move on. But Ethan Lawson wasn't built to back down. He exhaled slowly and took a calculated risk. "Your Honor," he said, his voice unwavering, "as an officer of the court myself, I have a duty to uphold fairness. If there is a pattern of disparity in how fines and penalties are distributed, then that is something that should be examined, not just for my sake, but for the integrity of this institution." Judge Mercer's face darkened. "You are dangerously close to overstepping, Mr. Lawson," the judge warned, his voice low and sharp. Ethan held his ground. "I'm simply advocating for equal treatment under the law, Your Honor, which is, after all, the foundation of our judicial system." The silence in the courtroom was thick. Judge Mercer's fingers curled around the gavel, but he didn't strike it down. Instead, his lips pressed into a thin line, and he shifted his focus back to the papers in front of him. "Your motion regarding the tax dispute is under review. We're done here." He dismissed Ethan with a flick of his hand. The message was clear. Get out. Stop talking. Let it go. But Ethan had no intention of letting it go. Ethan returned to his seat, his pulse steady, his mind already planning his next move. He reached for his notepad and started writing. Judge's refusal to acknowledge selective treatment, patterns of disproportionate fines for black defendants, courtroom behavior, who received leniency and who didn't. His legal instincts told him that this wasn't an isolated event. If Mercer had penalized him so brazenly, how many others had faced the same treatment, people who didn't have the legal knowledge or resources to push back? The thought made his jaw tighten. Ethan flipped the page and wrote 2 words at the top. This was bigger than a fine, bigger than a single morning in court. This was about justice. And Ethan knew exactly how to fight for it. Ethan didn't waste time. The moment he stepped out of the Greenville Municipal Court, he pulled out his phone and started making calls. First, to a colleague at the U.S. Attorney's Office, someone with experience in judicial misconduct cases. Then, to a civil rights lawyer he knew from law school, a woman who had dedicated her career to fighting systemic bias in the legal system. By the time he reached his car, his mind was already racing with a plan. This wasn't just about what had happened to him. It was about everyone who had ever stood before Judge Ronald Mercer and left feeling the weight of something they couldn't quite name, but knew was wrong. Ethan's first stop was a local law office, where he met with an attorney named Marcus Tate, a defense lawyer who had been practicing in Greenville for over a decade. Marcus leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "Mercer," he said, shaking his head. "I've been watching him for years. Always harsher on black defendants. Harsher sentences, steeper fines. But you know how it is. People complain, but nothing changes." Ethan took out his notebook. "Has anyone ever formally challenged his rulings?" Marcus gave him a knowing look. "Not in a way that stuck. He's careful. No outright slurs, no explosive moments, just small, consistent injustices that add up over time." Ethan nodded. That was exactly the kind of bias that often went unchecked. Not loud or obvious, but quiet and insidious. A system designed to protect itself. But this time, there was proof. Later that afternoon, Ethan received a call from Mrs. Evelyn Phillips, a longtime clerk at the courthouse. Her voice was low, cautious. "Mr. Lawson, I heard about what happened this morning," she said. "You're not the first. I think I have something you need to see." They met at a small cafe just outside town. Mrs. Phillips, a woman in her 60s with warm eyes and a nervous energy, slid a worn leather notebook across the table. "I've been keeping notes," she admitted, voice barely above a whisper, "for years." Ethan carefully opened the pages. Inside were handwritten entries, dates, names, case details, fine amounts, and patterns. Black defendants were fined 3 to 4 times more than white defendants for similar offenses. Late arrivals from black individuals were penalized, while white defendants were often ignored. Request for leniency denied. Payment plans denied. Appeals dismissed. Ethan looked up. "Mrs. Phillips, why did you keep this?" She sighed. "Because I saw what was happening, but I didn't know how to stop it. I thought maybe one day someone would listen." Ethan closed the notebook carefully. "I'm listening." That evening, Ethan met with a local journalist, Vanessa Reed, who had covered cases of judicial misconduct before. He laid out the evidence, the notebook, testimonies from attorneys, the details of what had happened that morning. Vanessa's expression darkened as she flipped through the pages. "This isn't just a bad judge, this is systemic discrimination." She paused, then looked at Ethan. "I'll run the story, but if this gets traction, it's going to explode. You ready for that?" Ethan nodded. He was ready. As Vanessa prepared her report, an unexpected voice joined the conversation. A young black law student, Maya Carter, who had been sitting in the courtroom that morning, posted a detailed thread on Twitter. "I just watched a federal prosecutor get fined $750 for being 5 minutes late, while white defendants walked in even later with no consequences. This judge has been doing this for years. This needs to stop. Equal justice now." The post went viral overnight. People began sharing their own experiences in Judge Mercer's courtroom. "He fined me $500 for contesting a parking ticket, but let a white guy off with a warning. I remember him. He never let me explain my case, just ruled against me. This isn't just a bad judge. This is a pattern." By morning, hat bias in the courts was trending, and local news stations picked up the story. Then, national outlets followed. By the next day, Vanessa's article was published. Federal prosecutor calls out racial disparities in local courtroom. News cameras swarmed the courthouse, reporters demanded statements, and civil rights organizations called for an investigation. Under growing pressure, the Judicial Review Commission announced an official inquiry into Judge Mercer's rulings. Ethan stood in his office, scrolling through headlines, reading the messages flooding in from lawyers, activists, and everyday citizens. For years, people had seen the injustice, but felt powerless to fight it. Not anymore. The case had just begun. By the time Monday morning arrived, the Greenville Municipal Court was no longer just a place for minor disputes and traffic violations. It was the epicenter of a growing national controversy. News vans lined the streets. Reporters with microphones and cameras stood outside the courthouse, eager for a statement. The once quiet halls now buzzed with an unmistakable tension. Inside his office, Ethan Lawson scrolled through the latest headlines. Judicial bias exposed. Federal prosecutor challenges judges' practices. The Greenville Times. Racial disparities in sentencing. The case against Judge Ronald Mercer. The Washington Post. Courtroom injustice sparks outrage. CNN. Every major news network had picked up the story. That morning, the Judicial Review Commission officially announced an internal investigation into Judge Mercer's conduct. A formal statement from the commission read, "In light of recent allegations regarding Judge Ronald Mercer's handling of cases, particularly concerning disparities in fines and judicial treatment, the Commission has opened an inquiry to assess the integrity of court proceedings under his oversight." The announcement sent shockwaves through the legal community. A sitting judge being investigated for racial bias was rare, and the public knew it. While reporters scrambled to get Ethan's reaction, he refused to be drawn into the media frenzy. Outside the courthouse, journalists pushed forward as he exited a meeting. "Mr. Lawson, do you believe Judge Mercer deliberately targeted black defendants?" one reporter asked. "Do you think his rulings should be overturned?" another added. Ethan kept his tone measured. "This isn't about one case. It's about a pattern, one that needs to be addressed. I trust the Judicial Review Commission will do its job." He kept walking, brushing past the flashing cameras. This wasn't about sound bites. It was about action. Ethan wasn't the only one speaking up. Other attorneys, both local and national, began coming forward. Marcus Tate, the defense lawyer who had first spoken to Ethan, held a press conference of his own. "I've represented clients in this courtroom for over a decade," he told reporters. "I've watched black defendants be fined excessively, denied leniency, and treated with open disdain. This isn't a new problem, it's just the first time someone with power has challenged it. Former defendants also came forward, recounting their experiences. A black mother who had been fined hundreds of dollars for contesting a minor zoning violation. A young man who had his appeal thrown out without review, while a white defendant with the same issue was granted a hearing. A longtime bailiff who had witnessed the judge's selective rulings but feared speaking up. Until now. At first, Judge Mercer remained silent. Then, after mounting pressure, he released a brief statement. I have always conducted myself with integrity and fairness. Any suggestion that my rulings have been motivated by bias is a grave mischaracterization of my record. But the evidence told a different story. The Judicial Review Commission had begun pulling years of court records, analyzing fines, rulings, and sentencing patterns. The numbers were damning. Black defendants were fined 300% more than white defendants for similar infractions. Requests for payment plans and reductions were denied disproportionately for black defendants. Late arrivals by white defendants were almost never reprimanded, while black defendants faced immediate penalties. Mercer could deny the accusations, but he couldn't deny the data. As more evidence surfaced, activists and community leaders mobilized. A rally formed outside the courthouse with hundreds of people holding signs. Justice should be blind. End courtroom bias. Equal treatment under the law. Maya Carter, the law student whose tweet had gone viral, addressed the crowd. This isn't just about one judge. This is about a system that lets people like him thrive. Her words resonated. What started as a local protest spread statewide, then nationally. Inside his chambers, Judge Mercer sat grim-faced as investigators sifted through files. For decades, he had ruled without question. But now, the walls were closing in. The whispers among court staff grew louder. Even his own colleagues began to distance themselves. One judge, speaking anonymously, admitted to a journalist. There were always concerns about Mercer's rulings, but nobody wanted to be the one to challenge him. As the storm intensified, Ethan stayed the course. This wasn't about bringing down one judge. It was about setting a precedent. He continued working with the Judicial Review Commission, providing evidence, helping former defendants prepare statements, ensuring this case wasn't buried like so many before it. One evening, as he was leaving his office, he received a call from his supervisor, U.S. Attorney Julia Harper. "Ethan," she said, "the commission's findings are coming in, and they're worse than we expected." He exhaled. "How bad?" "Mercer isn't just biased," Julia said. "He's part of a larger pattern across multiple courts. This case, it's about to get a whole lot bigger." Ethan's grip tightened around his phone. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. Judge Ronald Mercer resigned 2 weeks after the Judicial Review Commission released its findings. The evidence against him had been too overwhelming to ignore. Years of racial bias in sentencing, disproportionate fines, and a pattern of discrimination that had finally been exposed for the world to see. His official statement was brief, almost dismissive. "I have always served this court with fairness and dedication. However, in the interest of preserving public trust, I will be stepping down." But everyone knew the truth. This wasn't an act of goodwill. This was a forced retreat. Still, Ethan Lawson wasn't celebrating. Because this wasn't just about one judge. Mercer's resignation sparked a larger conversation about the judicial system's failures. The state's Supreme Court ordered an independent review of municipal courts across South Carolina. Reforms were set in motion. Mandatory bias training for all judges. Oversight committees to review sentencing disparities. A statewide audit of municipal court rulings. For the first time in years, people who had suffered in silence felt seen. And it all started because one person refused to stay silent. Ethan's actions inspired a movement. Law students, young attorneys, and public defenders began re-examining their own courtrooms. Some started investigating local judges, while others began advocating for transparency in sentencing. Maya Carter, the law student who had first tweeted about the case, reached out to Ethan. "You showed us that challenging the system is possible," she told him. "Now, we just have to keep pushing." Her words stayed with him. 3 months later, Ethan stood inside Greenville Municipal Court, in the very room where everything had started. He had been invited to speak at the unveiling of a new Judicial Ethics Center, a direct result of the case. Looking out at the audience, he saw judges, lawyers, law students, and community members, people who had been directly impacted by the fight for justice. He stepped up to the podium, took a breath, and spoke. "Justice is not just about laws, it's about fairness and dignity. It's about ensuring that no one walks into a courtroom already knowing they've lost, because of who they are." The room was silent, listening, understanding. Change had begun. But Ethan knew the fight wasn't over. It was just the beginning.